Hello, my name is Arseniy Deriglazov. I come from Moscow. I currently work as a narrative designer at Alcat Games, and I'm also a PhD student at FO Erlangen-Nürnberg. Today I would like to take you on a little journey with me. This journey actually took something like maybe 2 years in my time, but I hope that it will not take as long today. So, the pleasure of turtling. How did this whole thing start for me? It all started with my board game play group. One of the games that we like the most is Twilight Imperium. It's a game of galactic conquest. It's basically a 4X game where your goal is to explore the galaxy, forge a mighty empire, and drive all the other empires into dust. And we started playing this game maybe even more than 2 years ago, but still it took us some time to realize what the best way to play this game actually is. At the beginning we just played it like a computer game, so basically what we did is what we see here. We used all our resources to build as many ships as possible, and then we started duking it out, trying to destroy as much plastic and then put as much plastic back on the board and destroy as much plastic. And we spent 8 hours playing and nobody won, because we totally forgot that the actual rules of the game dictate that you need to earn victory points, and earning victory points has often nothing to do with this fictional violence, so to speak. There are many different ways to do that, through diplomacy, through conquest as well, through politics, through trade, and through technology, of course. And so, after this first time, we started reading the rules better, and we understood how to play. And some people of our group evolved and started playing the game as intended, basically aiming for victory points. But some players kept playing the old way, which is they sat back at their bases, they built up their defenses, they built up their huge, enormous armies, and they had a lot of fun doing that. And they never even tried to get any victory points. But since they had such huge armies, they could engage in hilarious trolling. Because, well, if you don't need to win, you can spend the whole game just ruining the session for everybody else. So it was a mixture of two of the most despised things or playstyles in gaming, right? It's griefing and it's turtling. So this made me interested. Why did they keep turtling? And I decided to look into it a little bit more. Okay. Approaches to turtling in current literature. Can you see anything? Yes, finally. So, I've tried to find some literature on the topic, and I was not very successful. I found basically 2 types of papers. Some of them are not even really papers, they're not meant for scientists mostly. The first type is designer-oriented. They treat turtling as a problematic play style that arises from bad game design. Basically, they tell you that turtling prolongs matches, makes them way too long. They limit interactivity because each player sits at their part of the map and they don't duke it out constantly. It ruins the flow of the game, and basically there is a strong consensus, as far as I think, that turtling is a bad thing in game design. And there's a second type of paper about turtling, and it's esports oriented, and it's for basically a play style analysis or even advice for players. For example, this paper by Serlin was actually a book written by him as a pro sports player for other sports players, where he analyzes the different play styles. And so they basically talk about turtling as an extremely defensive play style, and they try to understand it as either an effective or ineffective strategy. It's a little bit different with Hrabitz. He is a real scientist, and he did a study that was basically an ethnography, where he conducted interviews and basically was trying to understand what makes different people play in different styles. In any case, I don't really think that any of these papers really investigated the things that were interesting for me. First of all, the motivation of players. Why do players turtle? Why do they think that it is interesting? And the second one is what are the effects of turtling, well, apart from what the game designers think of it. So, effects of turtling on gameplay. It prolongs matches. That is, of course, true. It's easy to understand that if most of the match is spent sitting in your base and stockpiling resources, stockpiling armies, you will not have a quick game, right? Turtling is the opposite of the rush. And actually, I wanted to talk about rushing in this paper as well, but it's too big of a topic to even start. But the prolonging of the match, while is normally treated as a bad thing by most video game designers, for example, Blizzard spent a lot of time trimming down the match time of a typical StarCraft 2 game, because it used to be like 20-40 minutes. Now they're trying to get it lower and lower. They were trying to get it lower and lower between between HOTS and Legacy of the Void. They, for example, increased the amount of workers that the person had initially, so that the start takes less time. And they also went for a completely different approach in army management. Basically, inspired by MOBAs, they gave every unit in their strategy game an ability, which meant that you couldn't just get a huge death ball of the most powerful units you had and just one-click them on the other point of the map and look as they destroy everything, which for some players is a good thing that you cannot do that anymore. For others, it was not as good, I guess for the turtles, first of all. So this effect of prolonging the matches, it rises the stakes and scale, and it's something that board game designers know actually very well, that if you want a game to be more dramatic, or more Ameritrash, as some people say, you need to make people more invested. If the people have invested more time, they will feel more invested. Also, the scale rises because you have more stuff on the board. You have more plastic on the board, or you have more units in a video game. In video games, it's also not only in video games, in board games as well. I think a very important factor is that it allows a player to reach this late game tech, the toughest battle cruisers, the biggest guys with the biggest guns and the biggest lasers with the biggest explosions, and we're going to explore why that is important later, although I think intuitively it's easy to understand that there is a type of player that are very, very much attracted to bigger guns, bigger things, bigger armies. The third effect is that turtling limits interaction between players in the early stages of a match. I think it's self-explanatory as well. If you're defensive, you're not skirmishing on the map, you're not scouting the other player, you're not interacting with them just as much as you would be. But I think that this effect is offset by a different thing that can also be that is also viewed as a bad thing by some game designers, although it could be also a good thing. It makes endgames more dramatic and decisive. Basically, if you start skirmishing from the get-go, you get a lot of small fights, none of which are really decisive. You can lose a couple, win a couple, and it's still anybody's game. If you get two huge death balls, usually it's just one battle to rule them all. They hit each other, and whoever is the winner of that battle wins the whole match, because they just the remnants of their huge army are usually enough to sweep everything that's left of the loser side. Now I would like to talk about motivations for turtling. I already started talking about them. I think that all of these effects, they can actually be viewed as not something that just happens, but as something that the turtle player actively wants to happen. And I think one of the reasons for that is that they want to manage flow and stress and discomfort levels of a match. Basically, the best example for that is StarCraft 2 as well. It's a highly competitive game, and the design team had a very strong vision that it has to be less about strategy and thinking and more about reflexes, about thinking on your feet, so to speak, about being quick, about being able to multitask, manage a lot of things at the same time. And as you can imagine, not all strategy players really like twitchy games and fast games. Some of them like a different style of game. And so I think turtling is a strategy that people use to minimize the amount of tasks they have to do at the same time. Basically, if your units are all in your map, or all on your side of the map, it's easier to know where they are. It's easier to control them. If you don't waste your time scouting and skirmishing and harassing the other player, you can focus on your economy. So basically, it's a style that lets a person decide how much of a challenge they want. So if we look at this graph that nobody showed yesterday, not at all, it's the first time anybody sees it. It's a graph that many game designers swear by, right? The flow channel. And I think if you look at that graph and you take it as dogma, it's very easy to see why turtling is seen as bad, because, well, instead of this steady curving thing that always has sort of the same amount of challenge and skill and so on and so forth, you get something like that. You get almost no challenge and almost no skill in the beginning, and then it dramatically increases during the big battle. Because during the big battle, actually, you need to manage all of your troops, and the more troops you have, the more difficult it becomes to manage them. So the skill ramps up, but I also think that you could plot different things other than challenge and skill. For example, excitement. You have very little excitement in the beginning. I would say the beginning of the game becomes a little bit like SimCity or like a walking simulator or a boring Eurotruck game. It's very serene. You're just in your base, heavily protected by high towers and guys with guns, and you're just basically building up a beautiful city, an utopia, if you can say so, right? And then once you have a lot of toys that go boom, you go out and test them. And here is where we go for another set of motivations. I think it has a lot to do with mimetic pleasure. It's actually a power fantasy. Many gamers play to feel more important, more powerful, and more exceptional than they are in real life, right? And being the commander of a huge army is very conducive to that. I also think that it's a sort of pleasure that is very underrepresented in most game design manuals that I have read, but well, I haven't read too many, so I'm not going to make this as a very strong statement. It's just my opinion. The other type of pleasure is the pleasure of acquisition and accumulation. All right, you get more stuff, you get more buildings, you get more resources, and it's pleasurable in and of itself in a way. And of course, it's also the thing that people like when they build villages in Minecraft or when they play city games like SimCity, the pleasure of creating and managing a huge complex system. So next I have some slides that just illustrate to me the somewhat pornographic extent of pleasure to be had in having a lot of plastic on the world, right? Just look at those ships. Something moves deep inside my heart when I look at them, and this, I think that a person who does porn studies could help us by saying that, for example, there's a lot of excess then, right? And a lot of phallic symbols and stuff like that. If we switch from board games that was a Twilight Imperium shot to a video game that's a StarCraft 2 shot, well, we see the same thing, right? We have a huge, massive armada of high-tech stuff penetrating the natural Zerg army, right? So it's sort of also culture nature there, maybe a little bit. I would be very happy if someone who had ethnographic skills made a study and found out whether there are more turtles who play for tech-heavy races and tech-heavy factions. This slide comes from a very different game at first glance. It's Europa Universalis. It's a game about managing your state, about also expanding it. It's very like Twilight Imperium. It's a bit different though, because you don't really have a lot of plastic on the board, so to speak, right? You get huge armies, but they are all samey, and the whole fighting aspect of the game is not as important as even in Twilight Imperium. But I think this illustrates the pleasure to be had in acquisition and accumulation. Basically, the most of time is spent watching spreadsheets, watching your numbers grow. And in that, I think these sort of games can be compared to clicker games. This is Cookie Clicker. It's an awesome game. I spent a long time playing it. And I really feel offended when people say that clickers are idle games. Maybe some clickers are idle games, but Cookie Clicker is not idle at all, because it has a lot of strategy. You can actually get more cookies if you put your brain power towards getting more production facilities. And getting more production facilities is sort of pleasurable because you get more stuff after that, and that's more and more and more and more and more, and the screen becomes more and more loaded, and the stuff in the middle is not quite as important as all the numbers that are running. And if you check here, you can see pretty much the same thing, right? It's just a spreadsheet simulator. The interface takes way more space than the actual map, right? And I think this formal criterion pretty damn good supports my claim that one of the main pleasures that you have there is just watching the numbers grow and looking for strategies to make numbers grow even faster. So, we come to the conclusion. Turtling is a strategy for managing stress and discomfort of challenge. Game designers, by nature of their art, they're not scientists, right? They cannot be neutral. They have to say, this is good, this is bad, we're doing it the good way. We as scientists have the privilege of not picking sides. We can say, well, it can have its pros, it can have its cons, and I think that this stance allows us to see that, well, turtling does not need to be seen as a disruptive play style all the time. It can be good, and some games even emphasize it, right? I think it's impossible to talk about turtling in Europe Universalis, or of course in clickers, because, well, that's the whole point of the game, turtling all the way through. Second, turtling gives us insight into the pleasure of acquisition and accumulation. I really think that the core mechanics and the core pleasures in all these games are very much the same, and by examining players who go for this type of pleasure in a setting that is not really meant for this type of pleasure, like a StarCraft game, right? StarCraft game, by thought of the designers, is meant for fast-paced, twitchy action. But some people go there and still do their best to have this type of pleasure. I think it's very instructive to look at their behavior there, because it's easier to see what they do differently against this background. And thirdly, turtling demonstrates that optimal score can be drastically different for different players inside one and the same game. It's, I think, sort of a dull point, but I still felt that I had to make it. And so, I thank you all for attention, and any questions, please?
Yeah, questions? We have 10 minutes, almost. Okay, Alex was first.
Thanks a lot for your talk. So the first question would be, would you like to differentiate maybe between single player turtling and multiplayer turtling? Because say I'm playing Civilization on my own and I'm turtling and I'm enjoying it and it's pretty cool and no one's bothered by that. But if I play a board game with my girlfriend and she's turtling and I'm hungry, and I'm like, alright, let's get over with this game already, and she's turtling, and I'm like really getting really impatient. Is there a meaningful difference here, or is this something you would like to explore?
Well, I think you highlighted the difference yourself. Of course, if you're alone, you don't have to think about other people, and if you're with other people, you cannot behave like you're alone. At the same time, I think that, well,
game design is sort of like any other art, is a thing where you try to pander to a special sort of demographic, right? I would say that most game designers would try to appeal to a wider demographic instead of trying to find a niche demographic. I think turtling players are a niche demographic, and they have their niche games where everybody is expected to turtle, and everybody knows that they're going to spend 8 to 10 hours playing a game of Twilight Imperium, right? But I don't know, I think that we could find a balance that is a bit more interesting. Maybe if we could limit the non-interactivity of the early stages, right? Give something to do to the other player, which is actually what the Blizz devs have done, right? They basically gave more harass options to all of the factions, so that if the other if the other guy in the match is too passive, you can basically start sneaking into his base without provoking a major fight, which you can lose, right? So there are many. I think there are many strategies that can be employed to make turtling more mainstream without hurting the people who do not like turtling or playing against them.
Cool. Arseniy?
Yeah, since you are mentioning startup a lot in your presentation, I would like to ask you about one, say, crucial aspect of
turtling, that is scouting. I mean, you cannot turtle successfully, so to speak, if you are not, well, at the same time really active in terms of map presence, but you also, I would say, give voluntarily a huge margin of agency to your opponent. So I would say that at least on higher levels, it's kind of contradicts this accumulation fetish that you also mentioned. So would you agree, or would you?
Well, I would first like to say that the fetish is a great word. I'm so sad I didn't use it. I'm going to use it more. And secondly, yes, of course, I a little bit misrepresented the actual challenge of being a turtle because I didn't want to focus on that. Serlin talks about that in his book, and it's a sort of it would lead me in a bit of a different direction. Here I wanted to focus on the pleasures to be had in turtling, on the motivations of the player, on the stuff that makes people turtle, right? I think that any playstyle and any game relies on these buttons that we have inside of us, and accumulation and acquisition are two of those buttons that are very good for pushing. And I think the quicker games basically did that, casual games before them, like Farmville. And I find it very fascinating that you can make a button look like a strawberry, and you can have a little counter in the end of the screen, right? And if you push it and the counter goes up, somehow your psyche processes it as, hey, I got more stuff now. And it's really fascinating to me, so I wanted to focus on that. Of course, making turtling a viable esports style is a topic of its own. I'm not even sure that it's the proper venue to discuss it, although I would totally do that once I'm on stage.
Jesper?
This is a very interesting topic. I was wondering, perhaps also if you are making turtling sound too good, right? So in relation to your kind of use of the flow diagram, I mean, certainly there can be a problem if players turtle too much and don't actually learn anything because they're afraid of venturing out of their comfort zone. They're stuck with the same strategies. It's actually not enjoyable. So there's certainly something that can happen. And so the second point or comment was just that it seems like one of the most popular games right now, like the Fortnite and the Battle Royale genre, are basically those are games that you design completely to prevent turtling. Right? So everything is about like narrowing the play field so everybody meets in the middle, having these special drops. So it's all about like trying to force people together, trying to prevent them from turtling. So does that mean that turtling has lost history?
Well, I totally agree. The part of the sort of my sales pitch was that turtling is underrepresented as an interesting way of playing amongst game designers. That's just what I feel talking to them, right? At the same time, I wouldn't agree completely that Fortnite has no turtling at all. It has this building mechanic, and it's basically building up a base. And some of the most successful players, right, they first scour the map to get resources, and then they build their fort. And this fort building becomes increasingly important as they advance in ranks. So it's sort of a mix. And well, I really like the example anyway, because I think that it illustrates that, for me at least, that mechanics are not always the most important part of a game's appeal. I think that the aesthetic and this button pushing is more important, and I just think that the genre pushes some buttons in us. Like the idea of survival is very primal, and so yeah, that's what we like.
Cool. Yes?
Oh, wait a second. I remember that I forgot to answer the first part of the question about turtling becoming problematic. It's actually a big topic in game design that you shouldn't give the players what they want because they don't actually know what they want. Very often you implement a mechanic that they wanted to have and it just ruins everything. And yeah, I guess it was my mistake that I didn't talk about turtles that basically they get forced to turtle instead of motivated to turtle, right? So the game becomes more boring for them because they are too defensive to explore other opportunities. Of course, this could happen, and I guess I should look into that. Thank you.
Yes, thank you. Super sort of fascinating and all over the place. That's why it's fascinating. I think sort of originally I wanted to ask a whole single player, multiplayer sort of question, but I think that's still fascinating to me. But let's stick with the multiplayer. Have you looked at are you considering integrating some of the stuff that's been done with Magic the Gathering sort of into your work like this, sort of a different meta, sort of the way that they've had to really deal with this idea that if a player accumulates too many resources, how do we sort of negate that? I think that in a way has legitimized certain ways of what you would call turtling as perfectly legitimate strategies because the game design allows you to burn them or control them or take them in a way where I'm not saying it's a perfectly balanced game, it's just that I don't think that people talk about turtling, there's just basically sort of blue-black strategies or something like that, right? So I was wondering if you thought about that and looked at that or would want to look at it.
I play Magic the Gathering myself. I scoured the internet and I found a forum post where a person says that blue-black is turtling and accuses and says that, well, basically, anytime I have to play against this highly controlling and very slow type of deck, I just want to quit Magic the Gathering altogether. But we all know that Magic the Gathering is card or crack, we cannot quit. So, I really wanted to do that. I actually had a slide about it and I deleted it like 10 minutes before the presentation because I got the need and I thought, oh, I don't really know too much about Magic. So I think that it is a very good example of a successful way of implementing turtling. And I also think that it's very interesting that it's also connected to grieving. Like in my play group, in my board game, turtling and grieving go together, and in MTG as well. So maybe there's a whole new topic there that we could cover.
Okay, thank you. Yeah, unfortunately that's all the time we have.